As stream flows, it turns the blade. And once the blade is turning, the blade now turns what they call the propeller. The propeller turns the gearbox. The gearbox now turns the shaft. The shaft turns what they call armature. This is what they call armature. When you go to that Oji Thermal Power Station and in that warehouse, you will see that in that their generator, there is a very big, massive coil like this that is bigger than, that is just as big as one-story building, close to one-story building. Then is an armature like this will be slotted inside. Then this shaft is the one that connected. The shaft is connected to this armature, and that shaft is the one that is connected to the gearbox. The gearbox is connected to another propeller, and the propeller is connected to a blade, a fan blade. Once the water is touching the blade, once the blade is turning, it will turn the propeller. The propeller will now turn the gearbox. The gearbox will now turn the shaft to increase the speed. What the gearbox does is to increase the speed, the RPM. Then once the thing reaches the revolution that is needed for it to produce electricity, it will now produce electricity high voltage. They will now pass it through a high tension. Then once this thing produces, this thing is going to create what we call magnetic field. Once the magnetic field is created through this armature, then the magnetic field that is created will now the magnetic field that is created through this armature will create what they call electron. Electron will now flow in this coil. Once the electron is flowing, because there's already an ongoing magnetic field through a motion. Once the magnetic field is being created, electron flow through this electricity, through this copper wire, and produces what they call AC voltage or alternating current. The current will now pass through this wire and now pass through the high voltage, that 33,000 kVA. Then this thing, when the 33,000 kVA will now pass through another step down. Then that step down will now go to our normal transformer, the commercial transformer that supplies electricity to all people's houses. Then once the high voltage is passed through that transformer, then there is a step down a coil inside that transformer. Another coil receives a high voltage, another coil inside, 3 coil inside the transformer will now step it down to 220 volts.